Welcome to Canada, the second largest country on Earth, covering a staggering 3.8 million square miles and stretching across 6 time zones. Canada is a land of breathtaking contrasts, from the majestic Rocky Mountains and endless prairies to lush rainforests and the ice reaches of the Arctic. This country is as diverse in climate as it is in culture. But Canada's vastness isn't just geographical. It's a nation built on rich traditions, vibrant communities, and stories that span centuries. Let's explore what makes this incredible country truly one of a kind. This is your girl, Her Majesty Valentine again, and welcome back to our YouTube channel. This is also reflected in its people. Over the course of centuries and millennia, Canada has been shaped by individuals from all over the world, bringing with them a wide range of cultures, languages, and religions. Although these differences sometimes led to conflict, they more often fostered mutual understanding and cooperation as diverse communities came together to build new identities in the entirely new nation. So how did this country develop? From the arrival of the First Nations people thousands of years ago to becoming one of the most multicultural and diverse places on Earth today. This is the history of Canada. The story of human habitation in Canada, like that of the entire of Americas, begins with the movement of people across Beringia, land bridge that once connected eastern Siberia to western North America around 16,000 years ago. Over the following millennia, this land bridge gradually disappeared as the global sea levels rose with melting the glaciers that had once covered much of the Earth's surface during the last ice age around 11,000 years ago, thereby permanently cutting off North America from Asia. The retreat of ice sheets allowed these early humans to move southward and begin to populate the land that would one day become Canada. Over the subsequent generations, Indigenous people began to form complex societies and speak a variety of First Nations languages which varied from region to region. Much of the eastern portion of the country became home to the Algonquian and Iroquois people, who ranged all the way from Hudson Bay in the north of the Atlantic seaboard of the modern United States in the south. One on the central Great Plains emerged the closely related Cree-speaking peoples who tended to migrate from place to place as nomads, following the vast herds of bison that roamed across the prairies. The western portion of the country was home to the Northern and Tahltan-speaking peoples, whose livelihood was sustained by the abundant salmon stocks of the region, as well as the great cedar trees, which they used for building homes, cones, and totem poles. Meanwhile, in the frozen far north of the country emerged the distinct Inuit people who arranged across the Arctic archipelago all the way from Alaska to Greenland. Unlike the rest of the Americas, however, which dates the discovery of the continent by Europeans to the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, Canada is unique in that it predates this event by almost 500 years. Sometimes during the early 11th century, the Vikings, who had already explored and settled in Iceland and parts of Greenland, began to venture farther westward toward the coast of Northern America. Leif Erikson is now considered to have been the first European to set foot on the continent, part of which he named Helluland and Markland, most likely corresponding to what is now Baffin Island and the coast of Labrador. Erikson continued to explore the coastline farther south and went on to establish the first non-European settlement in the whole of Americas. possibly at the site of what is now Lance Meadows in Newfoundland. The Vikings named this area Vinland, and the settlement itself served as a base of operation for further exploratory voyages up and down the coast, where at some point the first contact between Europeans and Native Americans, whom the Vikings called the Skrillex, was made. The immense distance between the Norse colonies in North America and their Scandinavian homelands meant that communication was often a long, slow, drawn-out process. Awareness of the North American continent's existence subsequently faded from European knowledge with the departure of the Vikings, and it would only become known again some 5 years later. In 1497, just 5 years later, the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus' discovery of the Caribbean and Central America, another Italian explorer named Giovanni Caboto, better known as John Caboto, was in the employ of the English crown, became the first European since the Norse to once again lay eyes on the coast of North America. Subsequent voyages to the region were made by English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese explorers during the early 16th century. Despite these powers laying competing claims to the territory in one form or the other, none of these claims were backed by permanent settlements or colonies. It was only in 1534 that the French explorer Jacques Cartier made a foray into Gulf of St. Lawrence and claimed the territory on behalf of France, naming it after the local Native American word for settlement, Kanata. His two subsequent voyages to the region saw him venture further down the St. Lawrence River and construct the first French settlements. Although these ended in failure, nevertheless, his effort put Canada on the map as a prospective and potential lucrative colony. By the turn of the 17th century, only a handful of determined European fishermen and fur traders continued to frequent Canada's shores. However, in 1603, the Frenchman Samuel de Champlain began undertaking a series of expeditions to explore and map the territory in greater detail. He identified the sites for permanent French settlements, establishing Port Royal in Nova Scotia in 1605, as well as founding the city of Quebec in 1608, which would later become the capital of the entire territory of the New France. Champlain also explored deep into the interior of Canada, becoming the first known European to lay eyes on Great Lakes and to establish relations with the First Nations peoples of the region. As a result of his efforts, as a slow but steady trickle of immigrants began to arrive in New France's colonial settlements, which by the mid-17th century amounted to the population of a little over 3,000 people. However, the French were not the only Europeans to have established settlements by this time. The English, led by Humphrey Gilbert, had claimed sovereignty over St. John's, Newfoundland back in 1583. This was followed almost a century later in 1670 by the establishment of Hudson's Bay Company, which operated a series of fur trading posts and fought across an immense swath of the northern Canada known as Rupert's Land. This was designed to compete with French fur traders further to the south. So much so that by the beginning of the 18th century, what is now Canada and the United States had effectively been divided into two European spheres of influence. One French, encompassing St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and extending down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, and the other British, which controlled the area around Hudson Bay, as well as practically the entire eastern seaboard of the Northern American continent, stretching all the way from Georgia to the Newfoundland. As a result of competing colonial interests between the two powers, conflict over territory and the resources was almost inevitable. From the late 17th to the mid-18th century, civil wars between French and British broke out, which saw the boundaries and possessions of their respective North American empires shift back and forth. It was only the outbreak of French and Indian War in 1754 that the most significant and lasting territorial change in Canada's history would take place. This regional conflict was part of the wider 7 Years' War, which was fought around the world and pitted a host of European powers, including France and Britain, along with their overseas colonies, and British 13 colonies, along with their Canadian provinces. Despite upper hand early in the war, the French gradually began to lose ground. First in Nova Scotia, where the French-speaking population, known as the Acadians, were expelled by British, and then in 1759 came the decisive blow when the heart of New France itself, Quebec, fell to British forces, allowing the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Other French towns and cities in Canada fell to the British the following year, and by the war's end in 1763, France, having been brutally defeated, formally renounced all claims to territory and mainland North America. Canada then passed into British rule, which began with attempts to repair relations with the various Native American peoples of the region, many of whom had been forced to take sides in the previous conflict. The British also resented most of the property, religious, political, and social customs of the French-speaking population in the Quebec region, allowing them to retain their language and legal traditions, many of which remain in place to this day. However, despite the British government's best effort to consolidate their territorial gains across North America, trouble was already brewing, not in their Canadian colonies, but in the American ones. Grievances over taxation and political representation eventually escalated to the point where the American 13 colonies rebelled and began a revolutionary war to rid themselves of British rule. Although some in Canada sympathized with the American revolutionaries, most remained loyal to Britain and supported the war effort. This attracted an invasion, albeit an unsuccessful one, of Quebec by the American Continental Army in 1775. For the remainder of the war, Canada served as a secure base of operations for the British troops to conduct their campaigns to the south. The war was finally brought to an end in 1783, with the newly independent United States of America emerging victorious and establishing its borders with what then became the remainder of British North America. These borders were largely built upon the pre-existing outline of the former 13 colonies and were bounded by St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes and Mississippi River, and the 45 and 49 parallels. In that same year, the British also began evacuating their troops from New York City, along with many American loyalties who did not wish to remain in the United States. Many were transported to Canada, where they formed new communities in Nova Scotia and helped to establish the entirely new colony of New Brunswick. Some were also settled in Quebec, which in 1791 was divided into largely French-speaking Lower Canada and the English-speaking Upper Canada, which, with its capital at York, modern-day Toronto, founded in 1796. Meanwhile, far to the west on the Pacific coast, efforts were underway to bring this region, what would later become part of Canada, under British rule. Although the Spanish were the first European power to explore the region in the mid-1770s, they failed to back up their claims with any lasting settlement. It ultimately fell to British to assert a lasting influence in the Pacific Northwest, beginning with the Captain James Cook, who visited Vancouver Island in 1778 as a part of his voyage across the Pacific. As a result, during 1790s, further efforts were made to open up a Pacific Northwest to British fur traders. Not only were more maritime expeditions sent to explore the region, such as that George Vancouver, who arrived in 1792, but overland missions were also undertaken. Figures such as Sir Alexander Mackenzie pioneered previously uncharted routes through the Rocky Mountains to reach the Pacific Ocean, which then allowed the establishment of further settlements in what would become territories of Vancouver Island and British Columbia. However, the competing commercial interests of British and American fur traders would lead to the region becoming heavily disputed between the two powers for the decades that followed. With the turn of the 19th century, however, peace between Britain and the United States had begun to show signs of strain. Not only were there territorial disputes as America began its expansion westward, but its trade with the Napoleonic friends whom Britain was at war with caused considerable resentment within the British government in London. As a result, trade restrictions were placed on American ships, and the Royal Navy took to pressing against American sailors on the grounds that they were British deserters. By the year of 1812, the Americans had had enough and decided to launch an invasion across their northern border into British Canada. The War of 1812 lasted for the better part of 3 years and was characterized by a series of back and forth invasions by both American and British Canadian forces into each other's territory, ultimately without significant results. When the war ended, the border between Canada and the United States remained more or less unchanged, with neither side having made any meaningful gains. To repair relations between the two nations, it was agreed to militarize the border between the US and Canada, an arrangement that remains in effect to this day, with the boundary between the two countries being the longest undefended border in the world. Despite the normalization of relations between the North American neighbors, some in Canada, particularly loyalties and the colonial elites, continued to harbor deep anti-American sentiments. Shortly afterwards, in 1840, both Upper and Lower Canada were merged into a single colony, the United Province of Canada, which set the country on a path towards becoming a self-governing nation. By the mid-18th century, Canada had begun to expand into geographical shape that were recognized today. The disputed territory began between Britain and the United States in the Pacific Northwest had been resolved with the Ogren Treaty in 1846. However, Canada as a whole was not yet a unified political entity, remaining instead a patchwork of separate colonies. During 1860s, the discussions began about uniting these colonies into a single confederation, and on the 1st of July 1867, the Dominion of Canada was formed as a fully self-governing polity within the British Empire, with Ottawa as its capital. Over the course of 1870s, the remaining colonies and territories of British North America joined the Dominion. Yet, although the country was now politically united, some within its borders did not wish to be part of the newly formed nation. Among us, the flat expanse of the Canadian prairies lived the Métis, a mixed race people of the joint First Nation and European descent, who fiercely opposed any incursion by Canadian settlers from the east onto the land they had occupied for generations. As a result, a series of violent confrontations occurred between them and the government forces, first in the Red River Rebellion of 1869 and later in the Northwest Rebellion in 1885, led by Louis Lay. The Canadian government eventually prevailed and used its victory as impetus to complete the Canadian Pacific Railway, the construction of which had begun in the mid of 1870s. This allowed the government to consolidate control over the vast territory it was now responsible for governing. The last spike was driven in on the 7th of November in 1885, and the first transcontinental railway journey across the country was completed in the summer of the following year. The remaining decades of the 18th century saw further Canadian expansion as the government negotiated treaties with the resident First Nation peoples in a bid to open up more territory for settlement. Many reserves were created for exclusive use of Indigenous people, although some were forcibly removed from their land. The government also launched assimilation programs such as the residential school system aimed at extinguishing native languages and cultures among Indigenous children and integrating them into Canadian society. The late 1890s also saw the discovery of gold in the Klondike region of the Yukon Territory in the far north of the country, attracting some of 100,000 prospectors. Although few would strike it rich, the influx of activity and development in the region nevertheless helped formalize the last boundary dispute between Canada and the U.S. state of Alaska. With the dawn of the 20th century, Canada had become a well-developed and prosperous nation, attracting a growing number of migrants in search of better life. Although it had established self-governance over domestic affairs, it remained a part of British Empire and was consequently drawn into the First World War, which broke out in the 1914. Canada contributed immensely to the war effort, not only by providing a lifeline of continuous supplies to Britain across the Atlantic, but also by mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops who served predominantly on the Western Front, fighting the major engagements such as Somme, Vimy Ridge, and Passchendaele. Support for Britain during the war helped to cement a strong pro-Anglophone Canadian identity. By contrast, however, it aliened many French Canadians who protested vehemently against military conscription between 1917 and 1918. The interwar years brought mixed fortunes for Canada. While the country developed socially with the establishment of ice hockey as the national sport through the formation of the National Hockey League, and made political progress, most notably by granting women the right to vote, it also suffered economically due to the effect of the Great Depression during the 1930s. Despite this setback, Canada gained greater political autonomy with the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which, along with the similar measures for other dominions of British Empire, set Canada on the path toward full independence in later decades. Progress towards this goal was temporarily halted, however, following the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. Canada once again answered the call to arms from Britain, replicating its area effort by supplying men and material for the war effort. This time, however, Canada also faced direct attacks in its territorial waters, where German U-boats sank a considerable number of Canadian and Allied ships. Despite the heightened threat, Canada was designed as a potential base for British government and the wider empire in the event that Britain itself was overrun by full-scale German invasion. Between 1939 and 1940, Operation Fish was carried out, relocating a portion of Britain's gold reserves and financial assets amounting to some of $56 billion in today's money to Canada for safekeeping, marking the largest transfer of wealth in history. Similarly, the court's mission was drafted by British military outlining plans to evacuate the royal family to Canada should the Britain issues fall to the Axis powers. The post-war years saw progress and prosperity return to Canada. Not only did it begin implementing a welfare state with the introduction of universal health care and old age pensions, but it also welcomed the last remnants of British colonial North America into the Confederation, with the Newfoundland joining Canada as its 10th province in 1949. The arrival of the 1950s saw Canada become more geopolitically entwined with the United States as the Cold War intensified. Canada became a founding member of NATO and a co-founder of North America Aerospace Defense Command NORAD with the United States to provide joint aerospace defense and ensure the air sovereignty of the continent. The remaining years of the 20th century witnessed Canada's transformation into the nation we recognize today. Although there were periods of political disruption, particularly with the rise of Quebec independence movement during the 1960s and the referenda held on the issue, the country ultimately remained united. As a symbol of this unity, the maple leaf flag was adopted as a national emblem in the 1965. More significantly, the Constitution Act of 1982 was enacted, formally severing the final legal ties to Britain and granting Canada full legislative independence. However, the country retained its connection to the British monarchy, with the reigning monarchy remaining as Canada's ceremonial head of state. Today, Canada stands as a diverse democratic nation that has been shaped by centuries of conflict, compromise, and gradual self-determination. Since the days of the arrival of the First Nations peoples, Canada has been forged by waves of migration from people all over the world, coming together to create a strong national identity that is rooted in resilience, respect, and common understanding of people's differences. From its sweeping landscapes to its cultural richness, Canada stands as testament to the beauty of diversity in nature, in people, and in spirit. Whether you're drawn to the serene wilderness and the vibrant cities, or stories woven into every province and territory, there is something in Canada for everyone. This was your girl, Her Majesty Valentine. Thanks for joining us on this journey across one of the world's most awe-inspiring nations. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an adventure. See you in the next one.